Today we are making the true Aussie classic Lamingtons. To get started, first things first, you preheat your oven to 180 degrees Celsius and just adjust your wire racks in the oven to the bottom third. So that's where we'll place our slice pan. Speaking of the pan, this is a 20 by 30 centimetre slice pan and we're going to grease and flour it. So some soft butter, just giving it a rough grease. So that's it. And to flour it, just about a teaspoon of flour, plain or self-raising, it doesn't really matter. And just tap the flour just to create an even layer on the base of the pan. And that will allow your sponge to have a lovely crust. And a piece of silicone baking paper, just coming up about 2 or 3 centimetres above the long sides. And that's our beautifully lined cake pan ready to go. The Lamington is based on the classic sponge. So we've got some self-raising flour here and we also have some corn flour, and that will give that sponge a really very fine texture. So self-raising corn flour. So the important thing with sponge making is to incorporate and trap as much air bubbles as you can. And one way to do that is to sift the dry ingredients, especially if you've got more than one type of flour, 3 times. And that basically combines those two elements, but also it creates a little bit of air. So that's number 3. Our other ingredients is some boiling water, and I've just got a small amount of butter here, and it's 25 grams of soft butter. And the heat of that boiling water will gradually melt the butter, and it'll be ready to put into the whipped eggs. We need some sugar, so we've got 2/3 of a cup of caster sugar. And it's really important to use caster sugar when you are making cakes because it has a lot finer crystal, and it enables it to be dissolved into the eggs. And speaking of eggs, we've got 4 eggs. Now to beat. Turn your mixer onto about medium speed. And then once the eggs start to get frothy and foamy, just gradually pour in the caster sugar. Turn the speed up to high and then beat that for about 6 to 8 minutes or until it's really thick and foamy. Okay, so our eggs and sugar have been beating for about 6 or 8 minutes, and you can see it's beautifully light in colour. It's very, very thick. And to test if the eggs and sugar have been whipped enough, you basically lift up the whisk and just draw a wave or a figure 8 across the surface of that egg mixture. And if it holds for about 3 seconds, it's perfect. We've got our corn flour and self-raising flour triple sifted. And what we do now is basically just in 2 batches, just sift over the mixture and just very gently with kind of wide strokes, gradually fold that in. And the aim of this is basically to combine the flour mixture with the eggs, but without knocking out all of those air bubbles. We've got our boiling water and butter, and you can see that it's melted. So just gradually start pouring that in, a little at a time, and just our last little bit of water and butter. And at this stage, what I normally do is switch over to a silicone spatula and just scrape down your spoon and just ensure that you've got no unmixed flour. So just gradually pour it in easily and evenly. Okay. And when you're making cakes in a rectangular or a square or a loaf pan, just push the mixture out into the corners, and then you'll be ensured of a really lovely flat top. Okay, now it's ready for baking. 180 degrees for about 25 minutes. So our cake is cold, and I've turned it out onto a piece of baking paper and cooled it on a rack. And you can see it's a lovely golden sandy colour. So it's really important before we even start to make our chocolate icing that the cake is really cold. So ideally you would do it a couple of hours ahead. So what I've got here is 75 grams of icing sugar mixture. The beauty of icing sugar mixture is it does have a small component of corn flour in it, so it's not quite as lumpy or as arduous a task to sift. So I really like it when I am making an icing. It's got some cocoa, some soft butter and some milk, so it's really easy pantry staple ingredients. On the stove I've got a medium-sized pan, and I've filled it up about 1/3 with water and just brought it to a simmer. So in recipes, when you read melt chocolate over a bowl of simmering water, that's what we need. That's what we need. So we've got our 750 grams of icing sugar, our 1/3 of a cup of cocoa, about 25 grams of butter. It doesn't seem like a lot, but the role of the butter in the icing is basically to set the icing. So just giving that a quick mix, and then in goes our milk. Now that will take probably about 5 to 10 minutes to melt down and become glossy and thick. So while that's happening, I'll just cut our sponge cake into 20 pieces. You can do it with a ruler if you're one of those very exacting type people, but I tend to just use an eye, and that's also I like to use a long bladed knife because it's almost like a ruler and a knife in one, and just hold each little piece so the cake doesn't tear. Now the fun begins, or the mess. Okay, so you can see our icing is beautifully melted and smooth, and a little indicator that the icing is ready is that it coats the back of the spoon. So really all that means is if you run your finger down the back of the spoon, a little trail will still be held there. And what else are you going to do? Pop that in your mouth. Okay, so coconut. So we've got, oh gosh, nearly 4 cups of coconut here, and just pop that into a shallow dish. Have a rack at the ready. And this is a bit like crumbing schnitzels. It gets a little bit messy, but my advice is basically to try and not get too many crumbs in the chocolate icing. So a fork, just lay the piece of Lamington on there and just gradually just let it slide down, so then the base is covered, and then pick it up with your fork and then basically pour over that chocolate icing, just so all the sides are covered. It's still quite thin at this stage. It gets easier once the icing is a tiny bit thicker. Okay, so you can see the drips are pretty much subsided. Just give it a little scrape on the side of the bowl and just pop it in there. And then with your hands, just gently coat in the coconut. And you can give it a press. The icing will move around a little bit, but don't stress about that. You just press the sides in. Okay, that's number 1. And then get the excess coconut off your hands, and then we do it all again. There you have it, 20 Aussie Lamingtons. In summer, pop them into an airtight container and store them in the fridge, but they are best eaten at room temperature, so bring them out of the fridge about 30 minutes before. They freeze beautifully. For a treat, you could kind of wrap them individually, pop them in the freezer for a kid's lunchbox or after school treats. And my biggest problem now is basically, which one do I have? Oh, I think he's smiling at me. Okay, there we have it. The perfect Lamington.